welcome to a very important conversation. Thank you for joining us tonight, and to all of our panelists on the call with us tonight. Thank you all for being here. My name's Randall. This is my wife, Kelly, and together we run an organization here in the coastal Virginia area called We Are the Echo. We primarily are focused on bringing support to foster families, adoptive families, and families in crisis. And we do that largely by leaning into the local church and helping provide resources for the people of the church and the organization of the church to wrap around these families. And so that's kind of our role, and that's what we love to do. That's our passion here, and that's what brought us to this big question and this topic tonight of racial disparity in the foster care system. And so what I would love to do for the next couple of minutes is just give you guys who are watching this an opportunity to learn who's on the call here and the voices that you'll hear from tonight. And then we're going to jump into the big piece of the conversation. Okay, so I'm going to start. I don't know how this is laid out on the screen that you're watching on, but I'm going to start on the top left of my screen with Bryce Johnson.
Hey guys, Bryce Johnson here. I'm looking forward to having the chat with everyone tonight. I get to serve as the principal. It's a privilege every day to go to work at Tyler Elementary School. I love working with kids. We have a vision statement where we strive to inspire passionate learners. And so we work very creatively with all types of kids, regardless where you come from, to get you to where you need to be. And so those expectations and support that we really push. So I love challenging kids and families to kind of go beyond where they've been. So yeah, that's kind of my calling, and I'm excited to chime in on the conversation with the group.
I should say, he doesn't like to be called this, but I should have said Dr. Bryce Johnson.
Cut that out, please. Cut it
out. All right. Next up is Edwin and Arial Jones. Why don't you introduce yourselves?
Yeah, well, once again, honor to be a part of this and this very important conversation. So, Randall and Kelly, we thank you guys so much for all that you're doing to make a difference. But I'm Edwin, and this is my wife, Arial Jones. We planted the Bridge Church in Hampton, here in our area, about almost 6 years ago, and honored to be a part of just seeing transformation and seeing change take place. So, yeah.
Thank you guys for being on the call with us tonight. We love you. It's been such a long time since we actually seen you. I think it's February since I saw you in person. It's crazy.
Right. Yeah.
Crazy.
Yeah.
Yep. And then finally, Aaron and Monique Ransom. Give us a little intro and a little details about you guys.
Aaron, and this is my wife, Monique Ransom. We are foster parents and adoptive parents. We've been foster parents for 6 years. And we also have our own podcast called the Fostering Hope Podcast that is centered around just foster care and all things adoption as well.
It's awesome. Well, thank you guys all for being on. You want to take it from here?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have said this is a big conversation. So definitely not something that we can just manage to squeeze into, this one time. But when we started looking at the questions that we wanted to address today are, why are Black children so overrepresented in the foster care system? And then why are Black foster parents so underrepresented? So we're just going to jump in. Yeah. So the first question, why are Black children so overrepresented in the foster care system? And we have some stats that we want to share. Just really these just kind of affirm that what we're saying is not our opinion. That the fact is Black children are very overrepresented. And so we just want to start at the very beginning. Black families are more likely to be reported to child abuse hotline and then investigated for child abuse and neglect. So this is mainly coming from first reporters at schools. A lot of times teachers are almost always the first reporters, sometimes doctors and other people. But yeah, so more than 37% of children in the US will experience some sort of child protective services investigation in their lifetime. But for Black children, that number jumps to 53%. So Black families are more likely to have cases against them substantiated and then have their children removed from care. So when they're being investigated, Black families are more likely to see as a risk and then actually have their kids placed into foster care. So Black children are twice as likely to enter foster care, and they'll stay there longer than white children. Black parents are also subject to termination of parental rights at higher rates than white children. So what this means is that there are more Black children in the foster care system for longer, and then Black parents are more often to have their rights terminated. For kids that are in the system 2+ years, which is kind of average for most kids in the US, white children are more than 3 times more likely to be adopted as compared to Black children. So then that means that we have proportionally way more Black children aging out of foster care. And like we shared before, what that means is for kids that age out of foster care without a family at 18, 89%, so 89% of these kids will end up incarcerated, unemployed, homeless, sex trafficked, pregnant, or dead within 2 years. So we talked a little bit about, when we started looking at the why is this the way? There were a lot of answers in the studies and statistics, and the experts say, one of the big ones was visibility and exposure bias. So we talk about mandatory reporters, often teachers, that report, that their children in trouble. So whether neglect or abuse or whatever. So the more kids in poverty, so poverty experienced by families and children of color, may just amplify their exposure to social service systems. So they call that, I think I said, the exposure bias, visibility bias. So if they're already in the system, then the chances of them having a case founded against them is increased. And then once they're exposed to a mandatory reporter, the Black families are more likely to be seen as a risk. So when we started kind of looking, like what we said, kind of looking backwards to see what the answer was, it kind of kept coming back to, less resources available, more reports of abuse, more reports of neglect coming from the Black community. And what it to us pointed to was poverty and race. And those are the two big things. So I don't know if y'all have some thoughts on that, or, just your opinions, experiences, anything like that you want to share.
Well, I think the stats are disheartening for one, to hear that and to see that there's a population within our community that statistically is more likely to be abandoned or to be pulled away from their homes, and then, to age out of a system and to not be placed with a family, that breaks your heart. And to hear it's not a distant problem. It's not the children in Africa or the children in China, but it's the children on your street who are experiencing these problems. They're the children in my child's school who are experiencing these problems. I think it hurts to hear those stats. It just hurts.
Yeah. And I think you just kind of mentioned, what were the two kind of some of the main causes? Was it poverty, and what it was something else?
Well, the theory I think that's presented is that poverty is one, but even systemic racism just made a big part of it, because when we look at policies like redlining that keeps people in economically depressed neighborhoods, that prevents access to certain services, but it also increases this, what Kelly was talking about, this exposure bias. So that's one thought, but yeah, Bryce.
I was going to add in a little from the school perspective. I know you talked about we're required, and we are required to, anything we kind of sniff that may be wrong, we're required, unfortunately, sometimes to turn in a CPS report, which does sometimes get taken down a road that it doesn't need to go to. And I know there's people that are reviewing these cases that may not have the same backgrounds. And so, unfortunately, they get overrepresented. I'm saying Black people in general get overrepresented in these CPS reports. I think ultimately it comes down to, for us, when I look at a school, it starts, and this is going to be a little off the path, but I think it starts with suspensions. Black kids are disproportionately higher suspended, especially at elementary levels. And so what it kind of creates this path. Once you start missing school time, you get further behind academically. Then you start building up a frustration towards school. You don't want to come as much, and that's when you start to see these flags start to kind of ring out. And really, I'm going to say it's 4 to 7 years old even. It's pre-K through second grade. Because once you get to that third grade year, if you are not on reading level by the end of third grade, I know you guys have all had the pathway to prison at that third grade, but there's also another stat. Students in poverty are 13 times less likely to graduate high school if they're not on that third grade level by the end of third grade. So it's critical that 4 to 7 years old. And when we're suspending these kids, that's one side of it. But then you talked about the systemic racism. This comes from teachers having too low expectations for I would say all kids, but especially Black kids. It's a systemic racist piece that kind of filters into schools, and we lower our expectations just based on color, and it's not right. So one big thing we're as educators that I'm trying to push for is, professional growth to understand what we should be doing expectation wise, and just because the kids a certain color doesn't mean we should be tiering them a certain way. And so that starting point for me, that 4 to 7 years old, I think if you get that foundation laid in an elementary school setting is critical. And that also requires a lot of communication and resources for families to stay plugged into the school so that they can be successful during those grades. So to me, once we started this topic, that was where I see this. You talk about getting in the river. That's where I start seeing this whole stream begin, and unfortunately, the flags just keep going throughout.
Yeah.
Well, and you mentioned something really good there, Bryce. A lot of stuff but something that really jumped out was that just getting kids the stability of being in school. And what, the Ransoms may be able to jump in with this is that, so once kids are in foster care, if you don't have a foster family that can say yes, so we live in Hampton, and I know you're at school in Hampton, Ariel and Edwin, y'all are church in Hampton. If there's a child that enters foster care in Hampton and there's not a family to be able to say yes, Hampton's going to call up Newport News, or Hampton's going to call Norfolk, or Norfolk's going to call Hampton, or Williamsburg, or whoever. We're going to try to find somebody in our community, right? But then you've got maybe a foster family in Yorktown and the child lives in Hampton. So then if they have multiple kids, what they're going to do is ask at some point, like, hey, can we get this kid moved to my school system, because they're going to be with us 2.5 years probably on average, sometimes less, but statistically about 2.5 years. Can we get them sent up here? Well, then what we know from the other side of it is 50% of foster families quit within a year. So you've got a child that may spend 2.5 years in foster care, but you're going to be with one family for 1 year, and then they're going to get moved to another family, maybe even another family. Each time they move, the chances of that child ending up with a permanent family just tank. But you've got kids bouncing around from school systems.
Yeah.
So, it's like they can't win on any front.
And I just know the connection with education and just relationships aren't built in that format. It's just so tough with that transit to move around and to be stable for school.
Yep.
What do you think? Why do you think the discipline is greater for Black children than for the rest of the?
I think I'll be honest. I think it's because the population of teachers are primarily white. I think they see color. I think that they have expectations that are not necessarily the same expectations at home. And so that disconnect in terms of school expectations versus home expectations, when at the end of the day, we should be working to creatively educate and get these kids to master the content. We lay these landmines down in terms of these expectations that are unreasonable and what we may have had as our upbringing, and think we want to impart that on these kids and it's just those and so therefore they're going to throw them to the discipline wolves, so to speak, and ultimately they get suspended at early ages.
What's a behavior? Is it a behavioral trigger that would cause a teacher to move that direction?
Yeah, it's some kind of behavioral trigger, the discipline system. We one thing I've been trying to work for and is a restorative mindset in terms of being able to acknowledge a behavior, apologize, express repentance, and then ultimately be able to make amends for it and go through those steps. But that takes time. And sometimes in the school system, it's just, okay, you've done this. This is what the handbook says, letter of the law, rather than actually looking at truly the intent and ultimately looking at, rather than, what actually was done, but how can we get the kid to make amends for and own their behavior so that when not only just suspending them, and okay, I get to go home and play PlayStation for a little bit, but no, I'm going to actually work the problem with them so that when they come back in the classroom, they're ready to, be a productive member of the class. And so I think the time involved with that, teachers just kind of throw up their hands and say, enough is enough. I'm just going to, write you up for this. And then ultimately we get, expectations to suspend this kid.
Yeah. The reason is because there's a trauma piece, right, associated with behaviors, and so that's why I asked that, and I wondered just what goes into trauma education for educators. But Monique,
not enough. And I just want to add, we are pushing for more character education, social emotional learning, big time. That's a huge issue in elementary schools.
Monique, what were you about to say? Sorry.
Well, no, I just wanted to jump in after hearing the statistics. I agree with Ariel that they're very disheartening. It's very sad.
Yeah.
But I struggle with hearing the statistics because we have seen like specific cases of why children come into care. And unfortunately, it's not just the teacher overreacting. I mean, there's some stuff that happens in these households that, and we know we have one case in particular where they've worked with the family for almost 6 months before pulling the kid. So a lot of times, even when there's a report, the child's not snatched from the home right away. Right. Social services works really hard with the family to maintain unity. But if it gets to a point where things aren't being resolved, and it's not, I don't think it's always, I guess it can be resources, but sometimes I think it's generational. Yeah. I mean, it's generational abuse. And once you get a child in foster care, the likelihood, I mean, I don't know the statistics off the top of my head, but the likelihood of their child, ending up in the system skyrockets. Like we've had children come in to our home that their parents were in foster care. So, there's no easy answer because truly a lot of times, these kids have to be removed. The home life situation. I mean, I think it's more than just there's lack of resources, but I think social services tries really hard to help a family if they need housing, if they need transportation. I mean, we've seen, and we have friends who have kids where, their social services works really hard with the parent, and so I kind of feel like there's no easy answer. I feel like sometimes you have to look at each individual situation. Now, I have seen situations where I've said to myself, hold on. Can you guys see us? Yeah. Our battery's going low. Where I have seen, where I've said to myself, if this was, a middle income white family, this child would not be in foster care. So I've seen it both ways, but I will say more often I've seen situations where, the child had to be removed. And if the judge sees that a child's been removed and it was not a reasonable placement or whatever, removal. We've seen it where the judge is like, no, that child's going to a family member, that child, that's not a, reasonable situation. So, I mean, it's happened with kids in our home. They've come in real quick, stayed a little bit, and the judge is like, nah, I think they'll be all right with, grandma or, so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Ariel.
I was just thinking, I know in some of your literature that you kind of sent us before we jumped on this call, so we would kind of have some knowledge of what's happening in the world around us. You mentioned how the lens that the social workers are looking through might not be an appropriate lens for the cultural context in which they're walking into. And so if the standard that's being used as the rubric to then judge how a functional family operates or how a safe home environment looks like, that standard isn't one that is easy if it's culturally, let's say, a white standard. So if we have a white standard of whatever white cultural norms are, and then we're going into houses of minorities and the Black community and taking that standard and trying to make it apply here, well then of course there's going to be some places where this just doesn't line up. It doesn't necessarily mean the house isn't safe or the environment's not safe or the way in which that family operates isn't safe. It just means that by our rubric, which culturally doesn't include this culture, then it's gonna lend itself to say, okay, well, yes, let's take them out. And I think those are the pieces of systemic racism that filter throughout all of different contexts. You know, we see that in the foster care system, we may see that in the school, in how we're disciplining children or how our expectations of children, or we're seeing it in so many different ways. And so what rings in my ears when I hear all of these things is that there are racist people everywhere. There are good people everywhere. And we need good people who love Jesus and love children and are vocal about the injustice that they're seeing in every single sphere of our environment. And so it's not just being a pastor and preaching on a stage and, you know, encouraging that way, but we need teachers who love the Lord and who love children and who are willing to speak up for the injustice they're seeing in that sphere. And we need Christians being foster parents and pouring into those kids for however long they're in their homes. But we need them everywhere, and we need to see the injustice that we see, no matter what our role is or what our vocation is, and speak to that, because all of those things play a role into this, you know, issue of foster care. And so I just think when we look at what's happening in our world and we look at what's happening in this context, all of those things are not independent of each other, and they all play a role in it. That stream is getting filled in one way from all these different things. And I just think that we, as the people watching this and as us on the panel, have to just be intentional with speaking to the injustice we're seeing in wherever our sphere is. And all of that helps to change what's going on.
So to Monique's point, as you were talking, this is kind of where my mind went. I think I don't have hard stats for this, but my gut tells me that this is maybe reasonable. Okay, so we'll just kind of leave it at that. That people in poverty, white or Black, it doesn't matter. People in poverty struggle in ways that turn into abuse and neglect, by and large. But we do know that people living below the poverty line 2 to 3 times more likely to live below the poverty line. Black people are 2 to 3 times more likely to live under the poverty line.
And poverty is the number one.
If that is the number one indicator, then of a child entering foster care, then how do we? And again, we're not legislators, so I don't know how to do this from a legal or legislation standpoint. But so how do we, from a social standpoint, help alleviate some of the pressures that these families feel who are living in poverty?
I think part of it, I think, comes back to kind of a little bit of what Ariel said, which starts, I think, with being an advocate, I think being a voice. Because I think sometimes it's easy to characterize people based upon their culture or based upon the environment that they may live in. And we see maybe differences in different environments, different cultures, different households, or whatever the case may be, and we'll easily just kind of put people in a certain box just because that reality is different than ours. And so I think a lot of it really just begins with, it starts, I think, with having some empathy, where we kind of take a step outside of our world and we allow ourselves to step into the world of someone else, to see their plight, to see their struggle. And when we see that, now we can be vocal about it. Now we can really get in the mix with bringing about some type of a change. So even kind of going back to your point earlier, Randall, I think a lot of a lot of the issues that we see taking place, I think, in the foster care, even when we see it play out in school, I do think much of it does come back to family upbringings, but I think we got to go even deeper than that. We got to ask, like, okay, so why is there more of a struggle if we even look at financially in the African American community? Well, why is that the case? Mm-hmm. And when we really begin to unpack that, now we begin to see the systemic issues and the systematic issues that lead to the brokenness in families, or some of the challenges that certain families may face, which then now begins to spill out into the classroom. And so if you have a child, for instance, and I'm pretty sure Dr. Johnson can kind of speak to this, if you have a child who's maybe being a little bit disruptive in class, and is having a hard time focusing in class, well, that's not necessarily because that person's, that child is a troublemaker per se, but he or she may get labeled to be that, mm-hmm. not knowing that they are coming from a home environment where there may be some brokenness, and not even meaning that the parents are arguing or fussing with each other, but if mom and daddy aren't home because they're having to work 12, 14-hour shifts, well, now you have children raising children, and so I think it's layered, and there's so much of a systemic issue in it. Mm-hmm. That if we kind of just treat the symptoms of it, then it just manifests itself in a different way. But I think we have to really kind of look at the symptoms and begin to ask, okay, why is that? Mm-hmm. Okay, well, why is that? And the more we begin to peel back that layer, those layers, I think that's when we really begin to speak to things that'll lead to some transformation.
I want to throw out something, and this you guys are maybe on one side or another of this particular statement, but because I know I was on a different side than I actually am on right now. But there has been an argument that has been persistent for a long time that fatherlessness is the leading cause of poverty, of criminal activity, of early teenage pregnancy.
In the Black community specifically.
Yeah, of all of these social issues that a lot of people will drive it back down to fatherlessness. And so, without giving you my opinion, I want to just I want to hear what you think about that idea. Is there merit to that? And if so, or if not, I would love to hear it, and I'm happy to share my opinion. But I don't want to color your opinion without hearing you first.
Yeah. I think.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Yep.
I think as a foster parent, I mean, seeing all the kids that we brought into our home, there is a lack of especially a godly father figure in the home. Right. So, and that's one reason that at least, for both of us, but for me in particular, is I want these kids to see what it looks like to be in a home with a man that looks like Jesus. And I think when they're placed in a home like that, I feel like there's healing, there's peace that's brought in, there's diseases that are cut off, and so many different things.
Yeah, and I will say that 100% of children that have come into our home, there has been a breakdown in the fatherhood role. Mm-hmm. I mean, whether it's dad abusing kids, whether it's drugs, dad on drugs, whether it's
lack of knowing what it is to be a father.
Right. So, I read the stats that you sent, and how they pretty much were saying that, fatherlessness might not be attributed to it, but and I personally have to look at the cases that I've seen, and in every single role or in every single situation, there has been a breakdown where the fathers, mom will try. Right. And what I'm not saying, I'm not saying it's dad's fault, because dad is caught in some generational cycle of drugs or whatever it is, or abuse. I don't believe that a man just wakes up one day and is like, I'm going to abuse my kids. Something has happened to him to cause that pain to his own child. Yeah. even when it comes to just young fathers. I mean, we've seen a young dad. I mean, he was doing what he thought he knew what he could do, but mom was carrying the burden. I mean, mom's working 2-3 jobs, busting her tail, doing whatever she can. And unfortunately, she just can't do it all, And so when dad is, at least he's showing up to court, at least he's showing up, but mom is carrying the weight of 2 people, and I know it can be done because, there's great single mothers out there, but I will say every child that has come into our home, there's been that huge gap, and I think, when you say, what can you do? I think as foster parents, our goal is to show a child something different than what they've seen. We're not perfect, trust me. Quarantine has solidified that.
We need Jesus.
Oh, yeah. So, but I do feel, when a child they see mom and dad and they're working together, or dad dropped the ball, but mom's trying to, carry it, or vice versa. Mom's struggling right now, so dad steps in. It gives a child a sense of security. And then, so, I mean, that's just kind of what we've seen. I know it's, statistics may not say it, or they might say it, or, some people might not want to talk about it, but that is a huge thing. And it's heartbreaking. Yeah. It's heartbreaking when you have a child who experiences abuse from a father, because now what do they think about our Heavenly Father?
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. And I would echo that. And I think, once again, we have to begin to ask the question, so number one, I think when fathers are present, the house is different. Yeah. 100%. We see this in the Bible, biblically. Joshua says in Joshua 24, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. That's not his wife making that declaration. That's Joshua. Yeah. And so Paul talks about this in Ephesians 5, that husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. Fathers, pouring into your children, not provoking your children. So there is, I think, a mantle that fathers are called to walk in, and an authority that fathers are called to walk in. And one of the things I think that we have to begin to examine is when we look at the family dynamic, there's been numerous statistics that have shown things like when the father is present in a home, things like the family is more prone to be connected to the church, right? So we see that. But then I think even when we kind of look at some of the disparities and the challenges that may kind of be impacting specifically African-American communities, and there is a link, I believe, to the father not being present in some capacity and being active, how that leads to a lot of the dysfunction. And so before we planted the church, I was a youth pastor in Norfolk, in one of the most difficult areas in Norfolk Park Place. And I love that area. In many ways, I feel like that's home. But I was constantly around children who, if I was to say out of 20 kids, maybe only 1 or 2 at the most had a father that was present. Mm-hmm. And so these kids were, facing a lot of different types of challenges. I had conversations with kids who found themselves being in gangs, and it was directly, I believe, connected to the fact that there was not a father there, right? But if we just look at it from that perspective, okay, we just the fathers need to be present. Well, we got to really ask, well, why is that the case, right? So, when we begin to open up and unpack that thing, systemically, as this country was established on slavery 400 years ago, the main thing that slavery was doing to break up the families was to take fathers out of the family. Yeah. So that was a systemic thing that was established centuries ago. And now what I think has happened is through the years, that same thing has happened, just in different ways.
Edwin, do you think that's become like a cultural expectation almost, if that's the way that it's been for 400 years?
I think in some ways it is a cultural expectation, and I think not surprised. And I think you're almost not surprised. And I think oftentimes people will characterize if I just look at it like, okay, Black fathers are not going to be present. They don't care about their families. They just abandon their families, or they're just abusing their families. And for me, I'm like, okay, if we just look at the surface, then you're going to come up with any type of explanation that looks convenient. But we got to really probe and really dig, like, man, why is that the case? So like if kids are being abused in the homes by fathers, which we know has happened, I think Monique brought up a great point. Well, that's systemic. Hurt people hurt people. So how far does that father wound run deep? And I think when we really kind of begin to deal with, like, have a comprehensive perspective culturally, then we're now able to, which I love what Dr. Johnson said, what Bryce said about having a more of a restorative perspective, as opposed to, you know, okay, we're just going to discipline you here. You know, by the time you get to the school system, we're just going to suspend you. It's like, no. We got to have a true perspective where we see not just in part, but to the best of our ability, we have a full picture. So that way we can really see, okay, this is really what's needed here. So I don't know if that kind of answers the question or not, but.
We didn't actually share the stats on that. We'll put the fact sheet out as we roll this out in real life for people. But one of the things that was most interesting to me, I think it was in here, is that a lot of times when men are rehabilitating back into their communities from prison or from jail, a lot of them no longer are allowed to live in some of the government subsidized housing that their families are living in, which is part of what contributes to the absence of the father. And that seems like a solution that has a relatively simple bureaucratic legislative response, right? But that was what was interesting to me was the perspective that, and that's why I brought it up, because I have heard for so long it's a fatherhood issue, and I agree that it is, but we had to ask the question, why? Why are they in a situation where they're not present with their children or with their families? Why is it okay to let that just be the answer? And I think that's why I was throwing that out there. It's a complicated issue, but yeah.
And if I could I think you bring up a great point, man, because let's just take the most recent event that we've seen happen. Like, we're all privy to what happened to George Floyd, right? So George Floyd has lost his life due to systemic racism. He has kids. Now his kids will grow up without a father. And all the trauma that now contributes to. So trying to go back to school, even though you've lost your dad. So Bryce will be able to probably speak to that. Like, there's going to be some issues that his children are going to have, they're going to be coming to school with. And so I think we got to look at, man, how deep does this thing go? Like, those systemic things that are rupturing families and have been rupturing families for years, Eric Garner, just all those, like, so I think it's just, if we just kind of, broad stroke it and be like, okay, Black fathers aren't present. So we have this massive, issue when it comes to foster care or whatever the case may be. But like we said, Randall, I think we have to really kind of go beneath the surface if we really want to bring about some change.
I'll just, if I could add just a little to what Edwin said. I think there's especially for boys, there's a masculine journey that you go along with your father, and there's critical parts that they miss out on, especially when they're pulled from that family, that it's unfortunately leads to where they don't know how to lead as a man when they become older, and especially as Monique talked about, they miss that spiritual father aspect as well, that they should be seeing represented through their earthly father. And so I think that piece, and you're right, the correlation between missing fathers and some of these disorderly conduct types of things in school is very real. It is a part, and the schools, I think one thing they need to do is be more sensitive to that and understanding of that, and how can we fill some of those voids as best we can at a school level. But yeah, I think I will add though to Randall's some of the stats. I will say that from my point of view, I think it's a part of the problem. I won't say it's the only piece, but I think and you talked about it being kind of layered, Edwin. I think it is. I think it's definitely a critical part of this conversation, that it does have a negative impact, especially on boys as they move older.
Well, and I think he's not on the call right now, but I think that's what's so awesome about a situation where you've got a mom and a dad in a foster parenting role who can step in and guide a boy down the masculine journey for however long they have that relationship, right? And that's not to say that if a child gets placed with a single mother in a foster care situation, that that there's no hope for him. But that's one of the things that is beautiful about a family like Aaron and Monique, who do have not only a stable father figure, but someone who also, in Aaron's role, who has the most stable father figure, right? To look to God as a guide in how to lead through really, really challenging situations. And so, sorry he couldn't be here to pat on the back. I know he doesn't care about that, but anyway. I want us to shift gears just for, we've got a few minutes left, and talk about question number 2.
Right.
And really just see what comes to mind, see what comes out of this conversation. So what's the second part of this talk tonight?
So why are Black families so underrepresented in the foster care? What we know is that, like I said before, foster parents, they will not. So within 1 year, foster parents are done without support. And no matter how amazing your caseworker communication works are, without support from the outside community, you be able to keep going. And so I think this is where the church specifically gets to jump in and wrap around families, like foster families, to continue to support them so that they can keep going on.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we shared some statistics that, I don't know the overall statistics, and I don't even know if they track these right now, of like foster parent, like what the numbers of foster parents. I know, Monique, you shared like y'all, as a Black couple foster parents, like y'all are definitely in the minority there.
Yeah, so it's weird because it depends where you are. So I know when we were with the Bear Foundation, we would go to foster parent support groups, and there would actually be a lot of minorities. But when we go to like conferences, where there's a lot of education, there's a lot of guest speakers on the topic. Yeah, I think we went to one conference, and out of like 3,000,
we were the only Black couple.
No, we weren't the only. It was like 1 in 10. 1 in 10. Oh yeah. No, we were about 10 of us. So, but one thing I do know is what I've seen too is that as a Black community, we typically help our relatives, right? So for instance, like I know like my father, when his parents could not step in and care for him, of course grandma, aunt like stepped up. So you see that a lot in the Black community. And even with kids who are placed into care, a lot of times you see relatives come out and really try to be a stable option for the child. So I don't know why I ask that a lot. I think, I think when kids see other people that look like them, though I don't feel like that is the most important, but when they see that, they're like, okay, like they look like me, but they're doing something, they're doing life differently, so I would love to see, I'd love to see more African Americans in foster care. I really want to see Christian African Americans. That's what we focused on is the church and recruiting and encouraging those in the church who feel like they're called to, because I think there's a different dynamic when you talk about God and how he can restore you, how he can restore family and forgives and can forgive your mom for what she's done, and how we can pray for your mom, and we pray that your mom, developed a relationship with Jesus, so I think that's kind of what while we love to see minorities, we really, truly, our hearts is to see Christians.
Yeah.
And Christian minorities are double blessing.
Yeah.
Well, you had said that this is actually something that we had heard before from another foster mom, that the community, especially the Black community, rallies around, it kind of creates this sort of secondary layer of family that
Right.
that is not as prevalent in white families and white culture, at least not in the one that I grew up in. But that's really interesting to me. And I guess maybe my question is, so do you think that maybe the reason we don't see the numbers is because a lot of these placements are really kinship placements, which don't always get tracked in the system?
Right.
Oh yeah, I think that's a good point. If they're not tracking, there might be more Black families acting as foster care, but if I'm taking in my cousin, then they're not noting me as a foster parent because I stepped up to be a foster parent for my cousin.
Right.
So there could be some statistical variance there that's not being tracked. And I think, I grew up, my father's mother foster cared. And so she lived in Pennsylvania. She had numerous foster children in her home. And so I was aware of the fact that she was a foster parent for people. But no one ever told me why that was a good idea. So I knew grandma took care of people. I knew that happened. And, sometimes they would come around, but there wasn't a transference of here's the reason why I did it and why that was of value. And here's why maybe you might decide to do it one day. And so I think there was a disconnect there and just the need to do it. And you hear so much of the people doing it for the wrong reasons and doing it for the paycheck, or you hear the horror stories of how it didn't work out well, and you start to think about your own family, and you don't want to put your family in a situation where now you're bringing in someone who's wounded, but we're all wounded, but they got wounds that you don't know about, and then how is that going to impact? And so I think in a lot of ways, just people in general, we can be just fixated on comfort for ourselves and taking care of ourselves, and we don't really look to how maybe we write a check, but we're not looking to how we can open up our homes. And I just think that it's from talking with you guys, and we are the echo, just how it's a lot easier than maybe you might think. And the horror stories are definitely horror stories, but that's not always the case. And it's not always that way. And so I think hearing stories like that and having you guys come and speak at our church really just opened my eyes to, well, this actually could be a possibility. And it actually could be something that we do. And I truly believe if the Lord wants us to do it, he makes the provisions for it, like he opens up the provision. But I think hearing the stories and hearing the need and hearing it locally, and not just hearing, well, nationally, there are X amount of children in foster care and whatever, but hearing, no, in our coastal Virginia area, this is how many kids right now need a family. Hearing that makes it more tangible, because I can't save all the kids in the nation. But if I know there's 5 in my community, well, I know 10 families, let's all rally together. And so I think maybe just even an awareness in our community, in the Black community, maybe of even how much it's needed and how easy it is to maybe get into that process might be some reasons why.
Yeah.
And one thing I see a lot, I see a lot of pastors at, white churches kind of, when it's a National Adoption Month, or Foster Care Awareness Month, you see that a lot from the pulpit, and even in our church, I know how hard it was. Can we just get a little, maybe a little section on the announcements talk about foster care? So I know that it's a struggle. I know pastors have a lot to incorporate, and there's so many needs. But I feel like we just don't hear that a lot in the Black church. And so we, I think that's where we're missing, because, truly we can talk about the system needing to change, but while we can't just sit there and wait while the system needs to be changed, we need to be in the trenches, okay, you know what, we tell our kids, they may look at you a certain way because of your skin color, but you know what, you be the best you can be, and that's no excuse. And so I feel like, when you tell a child you have a calling, you have a purpose, God placed you, you're not by accident, and they realize wow, you're right, regardless of what's happened, where they've come from, when they realize they have a purpose, and someone's there, okay, I'm not going to let you use this as an excuse, or I'm not going to, I'm going to walk with you through the hard stuff, but we're going to get through it. When they hear that, something in them starts to change, and then you start breaking off generational curses, right? So I kind of, I feel like, the system needs to be fixed, of course. We've definitely been like, yeah, this isn't right. But while the system is needing to be fixed, we also need laborers, and I think the biggest thing for me and for Aaron is that we pray, we pray like, Lord, send the laborers, the harvest is plentiful, and that's in foster care. There are just kids waiting. They're like,
Yep.
Who's Jesus?
Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
everyone that comes in our house is like, oh, or they love to pray. They love to hear, stuff. So
Yeah.
that's just kind of my 2 cents.
Yeah, there's talk about kids waiting, at least in Newport News, the latest number that we heard maybe a couple of weeks ago, there's 220 kids and 38 families.
Yeah.
That is a huge gap.
Oh,
Yeah.
So we've got to close this gap. That was before COVID.
Yeah.
Before COVID.
We expected, and I mean, there's an influx every fall, which Bryce, you probably speak to. There's because kids have been out all summer, and then we have the largest number of mandatory reporters suddenly having eyes back on these kids, and so they call it like the October wave of kids that flood into care. So now we have kids that have been out of school since March. And hopefully we're going to be back in school in the fall. And we already, Randall read the other day that a 1% drop in unemployment. Oh yeah. So
1% increase in unemployment translates to a 25% increase in abuse.
In child abuse.
Oh yeah.
Crazy.
I believe it.
Higher than a 1% increase in. So I mean, I don't know what that does, but yeah, when we first started talking with, the local offices here and asked what their biggest need was, I mean, everybody 100%, we need more families. We need more families. So that's where we were like, all right, well, we can go to churches.
That's always the answer, right? When
Right.
you ask them what they need. But now I think everybody's feeling it and feeling the pressure of what's about to come.
Right.
And I think, at least in the conversations we've had since COVID, the biggest fear is what we don't know. Right. It's the kids who are living with their abusers, and we don't know how to handle it right now.
Right.
And I think that's the thing that weighs heavy on us. I think that's the thing that weighs heavy on them. And I think in this conversation about culture and maybe some of the things that drive or that some of the things that impact or have influenced culture over the last however many years,
Right.
I think that there are some things that our eyes have been opened for some things, and I think that our eyes are continuing to open for other things. And some of these things, Monique, I love that you said that. Some of these things, we don't have to wait. We don't have to wait for a system to be fixed. We can just get to work.
Right.
And some of these things we can just do. And I think that's what's powerful about our own unction. Is that a lot of those things we can just take action on. And I think sometimes, especially, I mean, you could do it on your own for sure, but if we can like rally some people and start in the same direction, we can actually see some things moving.
Yeah, well, and I was going to say, and I think this applies to both of the questions that we really addressed in the conversations that we had. I think you're right, Monique. There are a lot of kids that are placed in foster care for very valid reasons. But then also there are kids that are exposed to foster care for probably not the correct reasons. And I think racism is at the heart of that. But like when I was reading through something the other day, I read this quote by Brian Stevenson. We just watched the Just Mercy movie, and it was good.
Phenomenal movie.
Yeah. But I was reading a lot about him, and he said basically he gave this whole TED talk talking about proximity, right? And so he said, if you're willing to get closer to the people who are suffering, you will find the power to change the world. And what we know and what we've heard is, this idea that like we keep saying, God, show me the hurt, show me the need, show me how to help. What can I do? And he says, move closer. You will see the needs. Move closer, you will see what to do. And I think that's the action, right? Is that when you move closer, we can see like that child is fine. That child is okay. Like maybe different culture there, but a little bit of education, a little bit of moving closer and understanding can resolve, you know, whatever might be going on. But the big issues there with the kids that need to be in care, I think moving closer and jumping in and saying, how can I help? Whether it's foster parents, whether it's supporting foster parents, whatever it is, I think that there's a way that we can just be there.
Yeah. There's different action that you're motivated toward
Right.
the closer you get to
Yeah.
initiatives, right?
Mhm.
I mean, from far away, I can say, gosh, I feel bad about what's happening to them, right? But as I get
Mhm.
closer,
Right.
even in someone's home, now I'm responsible
Yeah.
to do something.
Right.
I might not be able to fix everything, but now I'm responsible for a piece of it,
Right.
and I
Yeah.
can do something. And I think that's just right on the target.
Yeah.
Proximity concept of how we make a better how we make better outcomes for
Yeah.
families.
I heard a quote from a pastor from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Eric Mason. He wrote a phenomenal book called Woke Church, and even in that church, there's quite a few different chapters on restorative justice, and it actually kind of connects with some of the things that we're talking about tonight. And one of the things that he said is that proximity breeds empathy, distance breeds suspicion.
Mhm.
So the closer we get to people, the more we feel the brokenness.
Right.
So I think the more we allow ourselves to really kind of, as we're getting closer to God, it should lead to us getting closer to the things that cause his heart to break. And so when we see the gaps in foster care, when we see gaps in families, like it really should draw out a level of empathy from us to say, man, I may not be able to chop down the whole thing, but I'm gonna do my part.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just asking God to search my heart, Lord. How can I play a role in bringing transformation?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I want to give just another minute for any other closing thoughts as we get close to wrapping this thing up. But take a minute if anybody got something else you want to say. This is a great time for it.
I think one thing that kind of just piggybacks on what we've just kind of said to wrap this up is that each of us have unique things that God has just challenged us to do. And I think that we need to extend grace to other people who don't feel as burdened about the things that we feel burdened about, because God is burdening them about their own thing. But we also need to extend action in the place where God is burdening us. And so if we're like watching this and listening to this and feel like this ping on us about doing something, someone else may watch this and not feel that same ping. And you can't, look at them and be like, well, how could you not care about the 200 children in Newport News who need a family? It's not that they don't care. They just don't feel as burdened about it as you do. And if you feel that burden, then lean in there. And instead of so often we can just look away and just go back into doing whatever we're doing and busy ourselves to put us in a place of not caring anymore because it's not fresh in our minds. But if we feel that, then lean in there. We don't have to feel the pressure of fixing the problem. All that burden falls on God. But we are challenged to just do our step and do our piece that God's leading in. Whatever he's leading us to do, he'll grace us to do the very thing that he's leading us to do.
I'll just say we all come from different backgrounds, but it's critical for us to hear the conversation, and the only way we can feel that empathy is to have that conversation, be had. And so, regardless of the background, we all can start to have those conversations, and I think the priority to do that and be courageous enough to have those conversations is critical.
No, I just would say, I would just say, the one thing we can all do is pray, right? So if you don't necessarily feel called to foster care, the one thing you can do is, go before God and say, hey, there are children that need a family, Lord. There are people you're calling to do this, like touch them. And the one thing when I hear, the statistic about Newport News that kind of gets me as a foster parent is I know that, the more kids that come in, the people who are already doing it, they're going to look and say, can you take another?
Yep.
And as foster parents, you already are drawn to the cause. You already know, hey, if we don't say yes, like what's going to happen to this child, but it also causes burnout. So that's my biggest thing. I mean, even if you don't feel called to do it, just pray that the Lord sends you know, more families to answer the calling.
Yep,
Yes.
absolutely.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
All right, Pastor Edwin, would you pray for us?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you again for this conversation. Thank you all for just how you guys are leading
Yeah.
in this. I think it's needed, and to Monique, to you guys, man, just for being incredible foster parents, man. Thank you all so much just for what you guys are doing. I think it's the heart of God. You know, I don't think it's a one-person thing. I think in many ways, like, God has called his people to be engaged in this in some capacity. And so, so thank you all so much just for leading the way in that. So, but yeah, let's pray. Lord, we just thank you. We thank you that at your core, you are Father, and you have adopted us into your family through faith in your son, Jesus. And we thank you for that. We thank you, God, for how you have called your people for such a time as this to stand in the gap. I thank you for Randall and Kelly, Lord, just for the calling that you've placed on their life to be advocates and to be voices during this time. I pray, God, that you would strengthen their voice. I pray that you would continue to expand their influence, that they would be able to continue to advance your kingdom in this area. I thank you, Lord, just for those who are watching online. I pray, Father, that whatever it is that you're stirring up in people's hearts, Lord, that they would say yes to you today, whatever that looks like, however you're calling them to respond. I pray that they would step into the harvest field, because the harvest is plenty, but the workers are few. And so, Lord, we just believe in faith that transformation is coming. We believe that healing is happening right now, that revival is happening. We thank you, Lord, and we love you in Jesus' name. Amen.
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 Well, thank you, panel, for being here, for lending your voice and your experience and your expertise in this conversation. And for those of you who are watching or listening, thank you for sticking around and engaging in this. And we'd love to hear your thoughts on it, and we'd love to engage with you further. But I think the biggest takeaway is find your place. Find your place in this and lean into that and do it. It could be being a loud voice. It could be being a prayer warrior, and it could fall anywhere on that spectrum. And I think that's what's important. Like Bryce said, we've all got a part to play, and we've got to lean into that. We've got to lean into that role. So if there's anything specific that you would like help on, or you just want to kind of talk through some ideas, we would love to help facilitate that. You can reach out to us on Facebook. You can look us up, We Are the Echo, also on Instagram. That is our website as well. Our web address, wearetheecho.org. You can send us a message there, or email us, info@wearetheecho.org. Okay? All right. I think that's it.
I think it's it.
Okay. Well, thank you guys so much for sticking around with us, and we look forward to future conversations.
Awesome. Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.